Some fish living in the Arctic and Antarctic carry blood that should not exist. Their body fluid sits several degrees below the normal freezing point of water, and yet it stays liquid. No ice, no crystals, just cold liquid blood moving through a body swimming around in water cold enough to freeze almost anything else solid. This isn't a trick of temperature. It's a trick of chemistry, and once you understand how it works, it explains one of the strangest survival stories in the entire animal kingdom, including old stories about fish that get frozen into solid ice and somehow come back to life once the ice melts. Let's start with the basic problem these fish are dealing with. Regular water freezes at 32 degrees Fahrenheit. But ocean water, because it's full of salt, freezes at a slightly lower temperature, close to 28 degrees. In the polar regions, ocean water regularly sits right around that freezing point, sometimes hovering just below it in a strange in-between state. For a fish swimming through water this cold, ice isn't a distant threat. It's something the fish's own blood is constantly at risk of forming, especially anywhere it touches ice crystals already floating in the surrounding seawater. If ice ever formed inside a fish's blood or cells, it would almost certainly be fatal. Ice crystals are sharp at the microscopic level, and as they grow, they tear through cell walls and destroy the internal structure of tissue. Most animals simply avoid this problem by living somewhere warm enough that it never becomes an issue. Polar fish don't have that option. They live their entire lives in water that sits right at or just below the freezing point. So instead of avoiding the cold, some of them evolved a completely different solution: special proteins that stop ice from forming in the first place. These are called antifreeze glycoproteins, and they work in a surprisingly clever way. Rather than lowering the fish's overall body temperature the way antifreeze in a car radiator works, these proteins physically attach themselves to the tiny ice crystals the moment they start to form in the fish's blood. Once attached, the protein blocks the crystal from growing any larger. It's like putting a cap on the ice before it has any chance to spread. The water around the fish might be sitting at a temperature that should freeze its blood solid. But the moment a crystal tries to form, these proteins step in and shut the process down before it can do any damage. Some polar fish carry so much of this antifreeze protein in their blood that their body fluid can stay liquid at temperatures nearly 2 degrees Fahrenheit below the normal freezing point of their own blood. That might not sound like a huge number, but for a fish whose entire survival depends on staying in liquid form, that gap is the difference between life and death every single day, for its entire life. Now here's where the story connects to something a little stranger. Certain cold water fish, including species living in shallow lakes and ponds across parts of Alaska and Siberia, have long been the subject of local stories claiming they can be frozen solid in blocks of ice through the winter and still come back to life once everything thaws in spring. For a long time, this sounded more like folklore than real biology. But when scientists actually studied how these fish survive brutally cold winters, they found something that, while not quite as dramatic as the old stories, was still genuinely remarkable. These fish don't fully freeze into solid blocks of ice and then reanimate afterward. What actually happens is more precise and more controlled. As temperatures drop, the fish's body allows a limited, managed amount of ice to form only in specific areas outside its most important cells, usually in spaces between tissues rather than inside the cells themselves. At the same time, the fish's body produces natural chemical compounds that act like a biological antifreeze on the inside, protecting the more sensitive internal parts of its cells from the same kind of damage that outside ice would normally cause. This lets the fish survive in a state that looks frozen from the outside, encased in ice, barely moving, with its metabolism slowed down to almost nothing, while its most critical internal systems stay just protected enough to avoid permanent damage. Once the surrounding ice melts and temperatures rise again, the fish's slowed metabolism gradually speeds back up. blood flow returns to normal and the fish becomes active again as though nothing happened. It's not quite the same as a fish freezing completely solid, brain and all, and then simply thawing out unharmed. It's closer to a carefully controlled partial freeze, where the fish's body sacrifices the outer, less critical areas to ice formation while actively defending the parts it absolutely cannot afford to lose. This kind of antifreeze protein isn't just a curiosity for scientists studying fish biology either. Once researchers understood how well these proteins stopped ice crystals from growing, they started looking at other places this same trick might be useful. Antifreeze proteins, similar to the ones found in polar fish, have since been studied for use in preserving human organs for transplant, protecting frozen food from ice damage during storage, and even in some experimental medical treatments where controlling ice formation at a very small scale actually matters. An adaptation that started out as a simple survival tool for a fish living in freezing seawater turned out to be useful for problems far outside the ocean entirely. It's also worth noting that not every cold water fish relies on the exact same strategy. Some species lean almost entirely on antifreeze proteins to avoid ice formation altogether, keeping their blood liquid no matter how cold the surrounding water gets. Others rely more on the partial, controlled freezing method, allowing limited ice formation in less critical areas while protecting the core of their body. Both approaches are solving the same basic problem, just through slightly different biological paths, which shows just how many ways evolution can arrive at a workable solution once survival depends on it. This entire survival strategy only works because of a careful balance most animals never have to deal with. Freeze too much, too fast, without any of these protective systems in place, and the fish dies exactly the way you'd expect any animal to die from being frozen. But with antifreeze proteins circulating through the blood, and a body built to control exactly where and how much ice is allowed to form, these fish have found a way to treat freezing cold not as a death sentence, but as just another season to get through. So the next time you hear an old story about a fish getting frozen solid in a block of ice and coming back to life once it thaws, you're not listening to pure fantasy. You're listening to a slightly exaggerated version of something these fish are actually doing, using antifreeze chemistry built directly into their blood to survive in some of the coldest water on the entire planet where almost nothing else would stand a chance.